Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present here today. As Joy said, my name is Jason Anderson. I work as a riparian ecologist at Stillaguamish Tribe Natural Resources. And I'm going to be speaking to you today about invasive species impact on natural, that is also cultural resources. And I think it's a great opportunity to go right after that presentation that Cheryl provided, because you're going to hear a number of similar themes as we proceed. First up, I'd like to provide a little background on the Stillaguamish watershed. It's located in Snohomish County and South Skagit County in the northwestern part of Washington State. The Stillaguamish River is the 5th largest tributary to Puget Sound, that is the Salish Sea. It drains approximately 700 square miles and contains more than 3,100 miles of river, stream, and marine shoreline. Now, prior to the arrival of European settlers to the Northwest, coast Salish tribes, of which Stillaguamish is one of many, these tribes thrived in a resource-rich environment. The people hunted, fished, and collected a wide variety of plant material for food and skilled crafts. Technology included bone and antler work, woodwork, ground stone, and flaked lithics, that's stone tools. So from an archaeological perspective, cultural resources can be grouped into different categories. And these categories tend to focus on items or places. However, as an ecologist, I'd like to focus on cultural resources in a slightly different context. So I asked a number of people the question at the top of the slide. And I summarized it by saying cultural resources are essentially all things that sustain the culture and traditions of a people. So in these images, you can see examples of cultural resources or practices. On the left, you see Western red cedar bark. On the right, freshly harvested Labrador tea leaves. The top images show rose hips. And at the bottom, you can see a canoe paddled by tribal members. Now, these images represent different aspects of culture. They don't necessarily fit into the categories on the previous slide. Remember, those are the archaeological perspective. So with that in mind, I'd like to describe some aspects of how Coast Salish people used and currently use natural resources found on the lands and in the waters for cultural purposes. And I'm going to focus on these 4: construction, household, food, and medicine. Coast Salish people, like many native tribes and First Nations people, were skilled at fishing, hunting, harvesting, woodworking, constructing shelter, modes of transportation like canoes, artwork, containers, basketry. So let's explore some of these themes a little further. Now, I'd like to start off by saying a thank you to Stillaguamish Tribe's Education Department and the tribal youth for these models that were made and then photographed to depict traditional dwellings and modes of transportation. On the left, you can see a model of a longhouse, and on the right, different types of canoes. Wood was an abundant resource for Coast Salish tribes. Western red cedar in particular had many uses. Not only was it used for construction of shelters and transportation, but it was also used for practical daily uses. Cedar bark was removed from live trees in strips and then prepared for weaving into many items. For example, hats, baskets, mats, and other things too. Cedar and other woods were carved for different purposes, both practical and for artwork. Fishing, hunting, and gathering, as well as harvesting plants, was practiced by Coast Salish tribes, as well as many other tribes, as Cheryl talked about in detail. The abundant natural resources provided sustenance for the people, as well as an abundance for trade. Water is absolutely necessary for life, not only for the people, but also for the animals and plants that are harvested. Many plants were collected and used for medicine. For example, cascara, the bark from this tree, was used as a laxative. Cattail, flowers were used as a treatment for diarrhea, kind of opposite sides of the coin there. Devil's club, the root bark was used as a treatment for diabetes because it's known that it reduces blood sugar. Stinging nettles and rose hips, high in vitamins and minerals. And willow, its bark can be used to treat pain, like aspirin. So with that brief discussion about natural resources and some cultural uses, let's transition into a discussion about how invasive species impact natural resources. And natural resources and cultural resources often can be combined in the same categories. So I've listed some broad themes here that I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in the following slides. And a lot of these themes were also touched on by Cheryl, so you're going to hear some of the same things again. So as you know, the riparian area is the transition from aquatic to terrestrial habitat. Aquatic systems include rivers, streams, lakes, ponds, wetlands, or marine shorelines. Terrestrial systems could be a forest, a grassland, or something in between, like a shrub-dominated community. So since I work as a riparian ecologist, I'd like to focus on some relatively common invasive plants for the remainder of the presentation and try to show the connection between how these invasive plants impact natural resources and, by extension, cultural use of the resources. Reed canary grass. It's established in many areas in the Stillaguamish Basin. We know it for its aggressive growth and ability to expand rapidly and dominate native wetland plant communities. It is particularly common at disturbed sites where it can modify hydraulics and prevent the establishment of native trees and shrubs. Now, as you can see in these images, we have a monoculture of reed canary grass in a wetland site where the growth can reach over 6 feet high by midsummer. So the problem, of course, it's well established. It has such a thick root mass that native trees and shrubs just cannot establish. Native plant diversity is diminished and largely native plants are excluded. So what are we doing about it? We're working to suppress the reed canary grass and then introduce native plants, woody stemmed shrubs. And the goal is to increase the native plant diversity and suppress the vigor of the reed canary grass. We mow this site twice per year to prevent reed canary grass from going to seed, and we have planted willows, spirea, some cottonwood, and we're experimenting with introducing wapato, which produces an edible tuber for harvest. And I'm happy to say that cattail is naturally recruiting to this site. So we've changed places now. These images are from an intertidal marsh site near the mouth of the Stillaguamish River. Spartina, in the center part of the photo, affects sediment dispersal in mudflats and intertidal marshes by accelerating accretion. This rise in the elevation of the marsh, coupled with Spartina's tendency to spread quickly, can crowd out native marsh grasses, sedges, rushes, and result in monoculture. The reduction in native plant diversity and change in elevations can affect waterfowl use of the site. In addition, juvenile salmon utilize the distributary channels in this site during their outmigration to the Salish Sea. And both waterfowl and salmon are important food sources for harvesting for tribal members. So what are we doing about this? We're surveying for and controlling the Spartina at this site in coordination with the Snohomish County Noxious Weed Control Board, as well as Washington State Department of Agriculture. At the right-hand side of the image, you can see non-native blackberry. It can form extensive monocultures, displace native shrubs and forbs. Now, While the blackberry does produce an edible fruit, which I have to admit is delicious, it can also reduce native plant diversity. One issue with blackberry is that it acts like a barbed wire fence in a sense. It restricts movement across the landscape for tribal members who want to access the lands for hunting, fishing, or gathering. And what are we doing about it? Well, we mow it down, we dig it up, and try to keep it under control. It's so well established in many of the areas in the Stillaguamish basin that removal or eradication is not possible. So we're working to suppress it. Knotweeds. Knotweeds impact riparian forests. We know this. Knotweed grows in such dense stands that it can outcompete native plants, as well as very aggressively growing invasive plants like non-native blackberry. I think of well-established stands of knotweed like an iceberg. What you see growing above ground is just the tip of the iceberg. Knotweed can also be considered an allelopathic plant. So some of the chemicals in knotweed can be released into the soil through the decomposition of plant parts. It can also be released into the soil from rhizomes and roots. And these chemicals can inhibit the germination and growth of native plants, and also can suppress the mycorrhizal colonization of the fungi with the native plants. That soil community is impacted. And this can cause knotweed with a competitive advantage and interrupt the germination of native plant seeds.
Just about 3 minutes left.
Thank you. If knotweed goes untreated, the structure of the riparian forest can be altered over time. Fewer native trees can germinate and grow, which can result in less floodplain roughness, less shading and cooling of the riparian area, and then also less diverse habitat for fish and wildlife. So what are we doing about it? Containment and herbicide application for a number of years. With new patches that are not well established, 1 to 2 years may be sufficient, but for large acreages, we're working to wear it down over time. And like Cheryl mentioned, we do need to be cognizant of the fact that when we are applying herbicides to the landscape, it needs to be posted and it needs to be known so that anybody who are entering those areas know when they can return, when it's safe. I'd also like to talk quickly about tansy ragwort. Again, we know this to be toxic to livestock due to the presence of poisonous alkaloids. If animals eat it, it can cause liver damage. Now, it's unknown whether deer or elk eat tansy ragwort. However, this plant can displace native vegetation that deer and elk rely on for food. So what are we doing about it? We survey for the plant in early summer when the yellow flowers make it easier to spot. Then we hand pull the plants, bag them, and then dispose of the bags off-site. It's a tedious process, but we prefer to deal with the tansy ragwort populations in this way rather than an herbicide approach. But one problem we found with tansy ragwort is that the seeds seem to be viable in the soil for many years. This image on the right shows a field with tansy ragwort growing in it. We've been surveying for and pulling this plant out of the same field for over 5 years, and it just keeps coming back. So these relatively common invasive plants that I suspect most of the practitioners are familiar with: reed canary grass, spartina, non-native blackberry, knotweeds, and tansy ragwort. They do in fact impact natural resources, and by extension, they impact cultural resources because they prevent or restrict access to harvest the plants, the animals, and materials that are desirable. They reduce the abundance of desirable plants and animals, and they can affect ecological processes that favor invasive species. So in summary, invasive species impact natural resources, which have a direct link to cultural practices associated with traditional use of these resources. So I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation to speak today, and I thank you for your attention.